Welcome to the Inside Scoop Live podcast, where indie authors get personal about their books, their writing, and their passions. I'm your host, Sherry Hoyt. Join me for some lively conversations with debut indie authors and seasoned veterans alike. It's a great place to find your next amazing read or even get inspired. So sit back and enjoy the show and let me know what you think. Hi, everyone. Ian Crouch is on the show today to talk about his latest book, A Pyrrhic Victory, Volume 3, Fate, the final book of his historical fiction trilogy about King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a 4th century Greek ruler and military commander. Before we get started, here's the inside scoop on the author. Ian Crouch is a doctor living in Adelaide, South Australia. He has always lived there apart from 1 year spent working in England in the early days. His books are the result of a lifelong fascination with Greek and Roman history. He has the great good fortune to live with a wonderful woman in a country at peace. You can learn more about Ian Crouch and his work at theshapingofdestiny.com. Well, hi, Ian. Welcome to Inside Scoop Live.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking with you about your book. Tell us about A Pyrrhic Victory, Volume 3 in your series, Fate. What is it about, and what was your inspiration behind the story?
The basic inspiration is a lifetime interest in ancient Greek and Roman history. And Pyrrhus stood out as a great figure who really hadn't, if you like, received any attention from the point of view of a historical fiction narrative. And he was such an important figure of his time that he seemed to be the perfect subject.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of him before reading this book, and you would think, after reading it, with all of everything he accomplished, I'm like, wow, why haven't I heard of him? So, yeah, great idea for a trilogy. When you were crafting the trilogy, first of all, did you intend to write a trilogy from the beginning, or did it just kind of happen as you were writing?
I think it just happened. Originally, I thought it would be a 1-volume piece, but when it was clear that it would take quite a long time to tell the full story, there was a break at the end of the first volume, and then it needed another break at the end of the second volume. And the richness of the story just provided so much material. I was in no rush to bring the whole thing to a close.
Yeah, as a reader, I would rather it be broken up the way you have too, because honestly, no one wants to read 1,000 pages, all at once.
Exactly. It's too daunting.
So while crafting your trilogy, how did you ensure each book could stand alone while also fitting into the larger kind of historical narrative?
It was partly that there was a natural break between the different stages of Pyrrhus's life. The end of the first volume was a bit easier because he's had his struggles in the East and he's gone to Egypt, finds himself back in Epirus in a stable position as king. So that was a fairly easy natural break. At the end of the second volume, the Battle of Asculum was such a central event in his life, and although the third volume begins with him in the aftermath of Asculum, it's really the beginning of the last and final stage in his life. So it seemed a natural break.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of easier to craft ending when you have a historical figure. When you come to the end of his life, there's no more.
Exactly. And it was a lovely journey to go through his life and trying to portray all of the ups and downs that he had over the years. But he was such a central character because at the time, there was no real way of knowing which of the great civilizations would become dominant. Would the Hellenistic kings retain their power? Would the Carthaginians become dominant? Would Rome become the great power? And that really didn't fully declare itself until probably 100 years after Pyrrhus's death.
Describe your approach to balancing historical accuracy with narrative storytelling, because I love the way that it wasn't a lot of, just dry historical facts. Tell us a little bit about your process.
Well, I think the starting point was really creating the skeleton of the known history and using, if you like, the fictional narrative to put the flesh on the bones. So the one complete biographical narrative of Pyrrhus's life was written by Plutarch, and that's a beautiful essay of about 40 pages, and it presents really the insights into his character, his upbringing, the major events in his life. But it was a lovely basis to build, if you like, the fictional narrative around. But one of the most important things was to be faithful to the known history. So it was very important to get the historical framework complete, firstly, and then to create the if you like, the fictional narrative around that.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like historical fiction readers, they will call you out on the facts for sure.
Yes, 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 they would. Yes, they would.
And that's good, but you have to ensure the accuracy first and then
Yep,
just kind of, do what you did and
yep.
you talked a little bit about Pyrrhus's personality. What did you find most intriguing about him during your exploration?
Possibly how great a figure he was. I think if he had succeeded in his struggles against the Romans, he would be as famous as Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, because he would have completely changed the course of history. He's one of those figures that you have to look a bit more closely and search a bit of information about him to really become familiar with his life and his doings. And I think also from our standpoint at our time in history, a lot of us are probably a bit more familiar with the Roman history
Hmm.
of from Julius Caesar on, perhaps. I mean, everybody knows Alexander the Great, but there's a bit of a period of a not very well understood history for a lot of people, I think, between Alexander and the rise of Rome. And one of the people in that, if you like, rather obscure piece of history is Pyrrhus.
Hmm. He is, I feel like his personality is so contradictory. He's honorable, but he's ruthless. He's visionary, but he's short-sighted. And this kept me intrigued as to, what he was going to do next, what he was going to think next. I found that really interesting. I think the most interesting, I guess, relationship for me was his relationship with Hotep. That is so unique to me. I don't know if that is standard for that time. What historical evidence or insights led you to develop this dynamic in the story?
Well, I think it was partly the three or 4 years he spent in Egypt were incredibly formative. And one of the things about this time is that slaves, domestics, counselors really had a far greater role than you would necessarily expect. So, I mean, in recent history, you could think of the monk Rasputin and his influence over Tsar Nicholas and his family.
Mm.
During the Byzantine emperor, the slaves and eunuchs were very important advisors to the emperor, and sometimes they were a bit of a barrier to some of the more rational political and military people who could have advised him. So the idea of Hotep being an old friend from Egypt, who in the second volume is Pharaoh's representative to bring some bad news about plots that are happening with Demetrius in the Eastern Mediterranean, it didn't seem an unnatural relationship.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the dynamic of their relationship. I guess aside from Pyrrhus, who did you find most compelling to write about?
A figure I found fascinating was the senator and later consul Gaius Fabricius. So he is very much an historical figure, and he and Pyrrhus met a number of times and became friends. And in some ways, they were working towards a common ideal, but threading their way through the complexities of politics and rivalries ultimately made that impossible. But they remained good friends
Mhm.
despite the political difficulties.
Yeah. So during your research, was there anything that surprised you the most, either with one of the historical figures or events?
Well, not so much a surprise, but one thing that always struck me was how much detail one can find in the historical records. So, reading about these people, so much information is available about their lives from essentially 2,500 years ago, so that their positions, the detail about their lives, the detail about their political and military struggles, it's extraordinary that so much detail has come down to us.
Yeah, that is amazing. It seems like people were more detailed in that time and were very diligent about recording everything that happened during their lifetime.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
In our time, with all the access we have to information, how are we at, writing it all down for future generations? I often wonder about that. Are we as good as they were back in the Hellenistic era?
Well, I think in some ways the difficulty that we have is that there's so much both information and misinformation that, if somebody is looking back to our time as we're looking back to Pyrrhus's time, it could be more difficult to sift the wheat from the chaff, if you like, and try and find a correct historical narrative.
Yeah, yeah. Was there anything that you discovered during your research that stands out to you that you say now, oh, I wish I had included that in the trilogy?
Not really. I really had the time and the opportunity to deal with most of the important things, and that's probably why it took so long and took 3 volumes to get to the end.
That's true. So, how long did it take you from the start of writing book one to where you are now?
Well, I think it was about in the year 2000 that I started to make notes.
Hmm.
I made notes for about 18 months and then decided that I just had to make a start. And deciding on the title was a very important start. That gave me a hook to put my coat on, if you like.
Hmm.
So it was a fairly slow process. So volume one was published in 2010, volume two in 2015, and volume three 2 years ago in 2022.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, it's very thorough, and I've read lots of fantastic reviews on the entire trilogy. What was it like creating the dialogue? Did that present any challenges to get a feel for that authentic dialogue and relay that to your readers?
Not really, because the historical treatments of a number of the important characters had been quite thorough. There's obviously the purely historical literature, but also Plutarch's lives were a very rich source of information because,
Hmm.
as he described himself, he was writing biography rather than history, so that his idea was to represent the true characters of the people involved. And he would obviously talk about the important issues in their lives, but he would also reflect on quite minor issues which tended to reflect on their character rather than their great deeds, if you like. One of his very great treatments was on Alexander the Great, who's, if you like, the founding father of the Hellenistic world. Another major character, Demetrius, is one of his lives. Pyrrhus was one of his lives. And that gave, if you like, a very personal treatment to 3 of the most important characters in the concept of the books. And he and the other more perhaps historical writers reflected also on the characters and their attributes, both good and bad, so that I ended up feeling as if I knew these people and had an idea of the way they thought and acted when I started to write the book.
Okay. And that goes back to the detailed historical record keeping as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
So lots of battle scenes, and this book, anyway, touches on the emotional toll of warfare.
yes.
The concept of the Pyrrhic victory is central. Can you tell us a little bit about the term a Pyrrhic victory? What does that mean?
The term was really coined after his victory, his second victory over the Romans at Asculum. And when he was congratulated by one of his officers after the battle, he replied, "Yes, one more victory like this over the Romans will destroy us." So yes, he had a victory, but there was a great cost to his own army. So it was a victory gained at great expense. But the other problem was that although the Romans had suffered even more severely, they were able to reinforce their legions, whereas Pyrrhus was campaigning in a foreign land and had to rely on the support both of his own army and those of his allies. So he won, if you like, a tactical victory where he needed a strategic victory that would cripple the Romans' will to wage war, so that he was left in a very difficult situation where he wondered what he could do to try and tip the balance in his favour.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't specifically hear of that term before reading the book, but it's a very common theme, though. At what cost?
Yes,
What role does the concept of fate play in your portrayal of Pyrrhus's journey throughout the trilogy?
fate was quite a complex concept in the ancient world. And I mean, there's always been an argument about predestination and whether events are preordained. And certainly in Greek mythology, the idea of fate was taken very seriously,
Hmm.
although just as today, nobody completely understood it. But there was the thought that not even the gods could interfere with the process of fate, so that some elements of life, it's our own ability to determine them. And on the other hand, whether fate has previously made a decision that events will go one way or the other. So it's a very difficult concept, and one that certainly people in the ancient world were very much aware of, despite the fact that it wasn't properly understood.
Right, right. And still isn't. So, what aspect of the culture in Pyrrhus's time do you think modern readers might find surprising?
I think the depth of knowledge and the depth of sophistication of the society is always surprising. And you see it in the architecture, you see it in the literature, you see it enormously in the ethical and philosophical writings. Also, just take an example, some of the historical treatments. So Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War was a masterpiece of a great mind.
Hmm.
And if you think of all the things that are debated in various ethical and philosophical terms, all of them had been thought about by the Greeks and the Romans and the other great cultures. So the difference really, in many ways, between the modern world and the ancient world is the centuries of accumulated scientific knowledge.
Mm.
But in terms of their perspectives and their depth of understanding, with the scientific knowledge that was available to them, it is just remarkable.
Yeah, I'm still surprised at what you were saying about the research and the writing, and not surprised, but just awed by the level of detail that went into it. Because I mean, there weren't any computers; they were writing all this out by hand, and uh,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
In what ways do you think Pyrrhus's leadership style reflects or differs from contemporary ideas of effective leadership? And of course, the ideas of effective leaderships are probably different with everybody too. So that's kind of a trick question.
Well, the similarity perhaps is that he needs the support of the people of his country, his allies, and he needs the support of the army. Where it differs is that in his role as a popular king, a popular and successful king, he combines both the civil and military command in his own person, so that he really is the conductor of the orchestra and all of the decisions emanate from him. He has his advisors, of course, but the centralisation of power is really quite unknown in most rational societies in the modern world.
Hmm. How has writing this trilogy changed your perspective on historical figures and events?
It's been a very interesting study, and it's made me realise that there are certain times in history when the course of history has changed dramatically. So Pyrrhus was a critical figure in relation to the development of the power of Rome. If he had become an equal partner, if you like, with Rome, then the Roman Empire, which probably still would have existed, would be very different.
Mm.
Other single events that changed the course of history, take an example, the Battle of the Teutoburger Wall in 9 AD, where the Roman legions were slaughtered in an ambush. It changed the history of Rome in the Western Empire, if you like. So the extension of the Roman province of Gaul came to a stop at the River Rhine instead of going further east towards the Slavic peoples, which has left a very significant legacy politically in terms of the peoples that were or were not a part of the Roman Empire, so that it created the what was to be the French and German problem, which had so many repercussions through history. So the idea that certain people and certain events will change the course of history forever was something that became very clear from looking at the history of this period.
Yeah. Every action determines what is going to happen next.
Absolutely.
And if they just did one thing differently, or if they appeared on the scene 5 minutes later, or 5 minutes, I mean, just a second later, I mean, everything could be totally different.
Yes.
Fate.
Yes. So, one example, Alexander extended his conquest into India, and at one stage he was very badly wounded. If he had died in India, the whole history of the Western world would have changed.
Yeah.
The Macedonian army would have been left thousands of miles into, if you like, enemy territory without a leader. And when Alexander's life was despaired of, the generals even contemplated surrendering to the Indian army, which would have, modern history would be unrecognizable if that had happened.
It's crazy. And, you can go back and think of all these what ifs in it, but yeah, it's crazy. That's what makes it so interesting, though, too. It's like, wow.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think the most intriguing part about historical fiction is probably the research. Or do you
Well,
prefer the writing
well,
for?
I think one just really followed the other. My biggest hobby since university days has been reading Greek and Roman history.
Hmm.
And that was really the basis on which the idea of writing a book of historical fiction came to light. If you like, to make my own contribution to the interpretation of the history
Hmm.
of the era. And it has been the most delightful journey.
Yeah. How do you feel now that you're not spending all of your days with these characters as you were during the process of writing your trilogy?
It's a little bit like empty nest syndrome, I think.
I can imagine that. Yeah. So, do you have any plans to maybe work on another historical figure in another novel?
I've got a few ideas. Unfortunately, work is a bit busy at the moment, so I don't really have the time to sit down and start making some notes about the next work. I do have a couple of ideas,
Mhm.
but I'll have to plod away at doing a bit more background research before it goes anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Those pesky day jobs, right?
Exactly. They get in the
To kind of wrap things up, I'm going to ask a hypothetical. So, if Pyrrhus were alive today, what do you think he would make of our modern world and its conflicts?
I think he could possibly be a little bit disappointed that all of the problems that beset his world are still with us. The person who inspired Pyrrhus more than anyone else was Alexander, who had a vision of a world that was governed by a benevolent Greek ruler, and also his interest in Plato's Republic, where you have the concept of a philosopher king or alternatively a philosopher aristocracy, where wise people are the rulers and rule rationally to everybody's benefit. I think he would be disappointed that we haven't got there yet.
Yeah. I mean, that is kind of disheartening. I mean, all this time in history and we still have a lot of the same issues.
Yes.
Well, Ian, thank you so much for joining me on the show today and sharing a little bit about your work and yourself. It's been very enlightening. And uh, do you have a website for readers to learn more?
Yes, I do. And it's called theshapingofdestiny.com, which is taken from the name of the first volume. And I'm very pleased to say that there are a few things that I've asked the very nice people who look after the website for me have just today finally added a few things, such as your lovely review and your lovely 5-star review badge. So the website is now currently up to date. And yes, I'd be very pleased if anybody would like to have a look.
Okay, all right. Well, Ian, thank you again for joining me, and hopefully we can touch base soon.
I'll look forward to it. Thank you so much for our chat and for your time.
Thank you so much for joining me today for my interview with Ian Crouch, author of A Pyrrhic Victory Volume 3, Fate. You can learn more about Ian Crouch and his work at theshapingofdestiny.com. And be sure to check out our other interviews at InsideScoopLive.com.